Good evening, everyone. Tonight, I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Dunwitty. Peter is an affiliate professor in the biology department and in the School for Environmental and Forest Sciences at the University of Washington. Peter received his undergraduate and master's degree from the University of Wisconsin, and he completed his doctoral degree at the University of Washington. Peter has worked as an ecologist and restoration biologist for more than 35 years with conservation organizations, including the Massachusetts Audubon Society, the Nature Conservancy, and the Center for Natural Lands Management. His work for these organizations, and now as a private consultant, focused on ecological restoration and management, fire ecology, recovery of rare species, and conservation planning with many land trusts, non-governmental organizations, and state and federal agencies. He has conducted extensive research and published widely in diverse fields, including conservation biology, ecological restoration, invasive species, floristics, biogeography, dendrochronology, and paleoecology. Normally, I would turn this over to the speaker about now, but I have two additional comments. One, that studies of the size and length of the one Peter has been conducting produce more findings than can be covered in a single talk. So at some future date, I'd like to invite him back to share more of his results. So stay tuned. And my second comment is a bit of an historical aside. On March 5th, 2020, Peter was scheduled to give this talk at the Mountaineers Program Center. This was still a week or two ahead of the governor's shutdown, but we were concerned about gathering people in a closed space, so we canceled Peter's talk. A year's gone by and we are still unable to gather in person. There has been a lot of water under the bridge, and I just wanted to say with all sincerity that by the time Peter gives his next talk, I hope we will again be meeting in person at the Mountaineers. With that said, please join me in giving Peter a warm welcome.
Thank you, Shelley. Are people seeing my screen now? Are people hearing me?
Yes. We can hear you and we can see your screen.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. I'm certainly humbled by the large turnout, especially if some of you were part of the Botany Symposium today. You must be pretty nearly zoomed out, but hopefully you're on board for another half hour or so, 45 minutes. Let me begin by talking a bit about the history of the island, which is the islands, which is why I'm beginning with this old nautical chart from the Wilkes expedition. Native peoples lived for millennia in the islands of the Salish Sea and were no doubt intimately familiar with the plants that grew on the islands. But it's really only in the last couple of centuries that Westerners, armed with scientific perspective on the world, entered this archipelago and started collecting and classifying the flora. They attached their own names to both the plants and the islands, often several times over, as you might infer from the now mostly forgotten names on this map of the archipelago of Aro, as Wilkes termed this group of islands. And this is what now we call the San Juans. So just a second here. I'm having problems changing slides here. There we go. These earliest efforts to document the flora were carried out by ship's naturalists and professional collectors, and has continued up to today as botanists and taxonomists, as well as many amateur plant enthusiasts like yourselves have sought to uncover and catalog the biological richness in the islands. And it's really the cumulative efforts of these hundreds of individuals that built the foundation for what I'll describe to you this evening. So it's only appropriate that the first part of my talk will provide a little overview of these scientists and their work. Yet there are many facets to this grand endeavor we call science, and data collection is only the beginning. The heart of my talk will really take up where much of this earlier work leaves off. Although spending time in the islands with wonderful colleagues discovering new plants is really a joy, much of the beauty and mystery, if you will, of science lies in the search for patterns and meaning. So in the second part of my talk, I'll share with you some of the patterns together with our ideas of what may explain them and what is beginning to emerge from this wealth of data that has accumulated over the last 150 or so years. And this is really the realm of island biogeography, which I hope you'll find as fascinating as I have. Before I get fully launched here, I want to acknowledge the contributions of two colleagues. David Giblin and I began botanizing together in the San Juans in 2005, and he's been instrumental in curating the enormous number of herbarium specimens that comprise a significant part of this work. Adam Martin is a graduate student at Evergreen and has taken on the really gargantuan task of assembling, organizing, cleaning, and analyzing the data files from which this story grows. So what we commonly refer to as the San Juan Islands can be roughly delineated by the San Juan County boundary shown by the red line in this Google Earth image. However, they're actually part of a larger group of islands in the Salish Sea that extends into Canada, where they're referred to as the Gulf Islands, and east into Whatcom and Skagit counties. In this talk, I'll primarily focus on the San Juans, although I'll wander occasionally into some of these nearby islands. So let's start with a quick overview. 475 is frequently cited as the number of islands in the American side of this archipelago, although the exact total really depends on just what you want to call an island. 128 of them are named, which leaves a lot of unnamed islands, and they're not just all barren rocks. There's somewhere around 11 to 1,200 taxa in the county, which is about 30% of the entire flora for the state of Washington. Considering that the islands comprise less than 1% of the area of the entire state, this is a pretty surprisingly high percentage. About a third of the total flora is introduced, consisting of plants that by one means or another managed to find their way out to the islands in the last 170 years or so. The scientific documentation of the flora in the San Juans begins with a bit of a mystery. This first specimen we know of from the area is a collection of a Kamchatka fritillary made in 1792 by Archibald Menzies, the naturalist aboard the Vancouver expedition. The specimen is labeled as coming from Orcas Island, but no others of the species have been collected there since, and there is some uncertainty as to whether the species still occurs in the islands at all. Our next records come from the mid-1850s, when David Lyle, a Scottish botanist, made his way through the islands, leaving us with at least 3 specimens that I've been able to turn up from Orcas and San Juan. And here again, the mysteries linger. 2 of the species he collected from Orcas, Crocidium multicauli and Mechanella oregana, have never been documented there since. Mechanella, in fact, has never again been reported from anywhere in the San Juans. Crocidium was found once more in 1992 when several patches were reported from American camp on San Juan Island, but again, it has not been reported there or anywhere else in the island since. Serious documentation of the flora of the islands really began in the 1890s with a series of collections made by Lewis Henderson, a botany professor at the University of Idaho. Although he only collected 87 specimens, he managed to turn up an interesting array of species, including, of course, a number that haven't been documented since. I particularly love a detail that shows up on the herbarium labels, you can see here, for these specimens. If you look closely, you'll notice that they were collected for the World's Fair exhibit in Chicago. Try and imagine a time when people flocked by the thousands from all over the world to see dried plant specimens. By the early 1900s, Friday Harbor Labs was getting rolling on San Juan Island as well, and various individuals, some of whom were associated with the labs, added considerably to the growing number of collected specimens. T.C. Fry, shown here to the right in the photo, was a professor of botany at the University of Washington, and was perhaps most noteworthy of the lot, and led many field trips through the islands. It must have been quite an adventure dressing up in your formal attire to head out with Professor Fry on the Violet to do a little plant collecting on the outer islands, such as this excursion to Susha. And while we have only about 60 specimens of vascular plants from the San Juans, with Professor Fry's name as the collector on them, he seems to be considerably more taken by bryophytes and algae. Once again, a number of these have not been documented in over a century since he made his collections. I think by now you can't help but begin to notice a pattern here of a number of species being found by these early collectors that are rarely, if ever, seen again. There are a number of plausible explanations for this. With some of the very early collections, it's possible that the specimen labels or the island names were confused and they didn't actually come from the San Juans at all. Perhaps some species were only tenuously hanging on in small numbers and eventually succumbed. Some might even have been over-collected. Others may have disappeared as their habitats changed or were destroyed. And many of them may still exist and we just haven't gotten around to re-finding them again. So let me make a brief but important diversion to talk about how we go about documenting the plants that occur in the islands. The gold standard will always be a voucher specimen in an herbarium. If the only evidence we had was just what someone described in their notes or left for us on a plant list, we'd often end up hopelessly confused. Without being able to look at the actual Mechanella specimen collected by David Lyle, we likely would have little certainty regarding what species he really observed. Here you can see a specimen collected at Friday Harbor in 1910. And as it turns out, it was misidentified by T.C. Fry, as we can see on the label. After it was examined by a number of subsequent botanists, this collection is now recognized as the type specimen of what we call Micranthes integrifolia today. In the biogeographical studies I'll be describing tonight, we occasionally are forced to rely on unvouchered reports of species, but we do so cautiously and not without some trepidation. We have somewhat greater confidence where the source of a report is particularly reliable and the occurrence seems likely, but even this can be problematic at times. By far the biggest jump in our understanding of the island flora occurred with the seminal work in the 1980s and early 90s of Scott Atkinson and Fred Sharp, which they published in the 2 editions of their flora for the San Juans, which is still in print. Fred was just an undergraduate at the University of Washington in the early 80s when he began this work. I was also a graduate student there at the time, and I remember Fred well. He frequently wandered into the herbarium with some of his latest finds from the islands. Although they didn't do a lot of collecting, between the two of them, there are only a little over 400 of their specimens in herbaria. They were really keen botanists and traveled widely in the San Juans, particularly on the Big Islands. As testimony to the quality of their work, there are very few species that they reported that leave us scratching our heads today. The specimens they did collect provide solid documentation for the many occurrences of taxa that were particularly unusual or noteworthy. This finally brings us to our own studies, where we've begun to take a broader overall look at how species are distributed across the entire array of islands. This effort required developing detailed inventories of all the species that occur on as many islands as we could come up with. We began these studies in earnest in 2005 when David Giblin and I organized a series of surveys to document the floras on the smaller islands, including a large number that had never been previously inventoried. By 2009, we had visited a total of about 80 islands, two to three times in different seasons to make comprehensive collections of their floras. Another major push occurred in 2017 to 2018 with an additional round of surveys that I led to inventory floras in about 60 islands in the San Juan Islands National Monument. Most recently, I've begun to focus on some of the medium and larger sized islands, including several belonging to Washington State Parks, as well as the much larger ferry-served islands. The latter have required a somewhat different approach, which I'll speak about briefly later on. So as a quick summary of where we are today, in 2005, we had information derived from about 5,100 specimens collected mostly from the larger islands. This number has approximately doubled with our work since then. Based primarily on our collections, we have now documented a total of around 735 taxa that occur on about 140 of the smaller and a few of the medium-sized islands. These range from a 1 square meter rock with 1 plant on it to Salish Island, which is somewhat over 500 acres and has around 320 species that we've recorded. So let's begin to take a closer look at the sorts of islands we've been surveying and the floras we found growing on them. From this distant view, you can make out the largest islands we've inventoried, Peitos and Susha at the north end of the archipelago, and Vendovi towards the east. If we zoom in much closer in just one area, the Wasp Islands group between Orcas and San Juan, we can make out details on the much smaller islands. In this view, I've circled the 8 or so islands in the Wasp group that we studied, including Yellow Island, which many of you have probably visited at one time or another. It belongs to the Nature Conservancy. Another little cluster of 5 islets down in the lower right there comprise the Tift rocks. These range in size from about 100 square meters up to about half an acre. So that gives you a bit of a sense of scale about the typical range of islands that we've surveyed. So let's plunge in now to some of the questions that we're beginning to be able to answer with the recent data that we've collected from these small islands. I'll start out by looking at what are the most common species on these islands and some of the patterns we've observed among them. And 3 of those are shown here in this slide. So starting with the native species, here's a list of the top 20 for those of you who like to know exactly which those species are. But of equal interest, if Latin names don't appeal to you, I think are some of the overall patterns. First of all, the large majority of these plants are forbs, which you can, with a few shrubs and only 2 grasses. So you can see I've highlighted the forbs here. There's a few shrubs and just a couple of grasses. Fully 80% of these species are perennials. Just a handful of annuals comprise these top 20 species. And they're all quite widespread, with most of them occurring on more than 50% of the small islands. And I've indicated the 50% cutoff line here with this dashed red line. Now let's contrast this with the introduced non-native species. Here we can see that these species show quite a different pattern. In terms of their life forms, they are pretty much evenly split between grasses and forbs. And you can see the grasses tend to be the most frequent among the non-natives. Furthermore, unlike the natives, which were mostly perennials, almost all of the common non-natives are annuals. They also tend not to be as ubiquitous as the natives. Among these non-native species, only the top 7 there above the dashed line are present on over half of the small islands. See if you can come up with some ideas about why the natives and non-natives exhibit such different patterns. I think it will be pretty obvious if you think about it for a bit, but I'm not going to spill all the answers. If we look at these same data, frequency data, in a slightly different way, another pattern becomes evident. Most of the species don't occur on very many islands. If we start by looking at the left side of this graph, we can see that about 140 species occurred on only a single island, and about 47%, nearly half of the species, were found on just 3 islands. Now, this doesn't mean that all 140 species, or half of the species, were found on the same 1 or 2 or 3 islands. But if we look closely at the raw data, it turns out that the species represented by these first 3 bars in the graph occurred mostly on just a few of the larger islands that we sampled. So as we delve deeper into the biogeography of the plants in the islands, there are a host of questions that we can use the data we've collected to begin to answer. How are they dispersed? How does the mode of dispersal by wind, water, birds, humans, and so forth differ among the various groups of species and among the islands that differ in area, distance from the mainland, annual precipitation, geology, so forth? Where are the plants coming from? And when did they arrive in the islands? These and many other questions are the sorts of things we're beginning to explore in different ways with our data. So let me start with a question that has long been of interest to island biogeographers, and that's how does the number of species vary among the islands? One of the simplest ways to begin to explore this question is to plot our data in a graph showing the number of species found on each island, here on the vertical axis, against the island's area on the horizontal axis. And in this first figure, just looking at our data from the smaller islands, a pretty clear and perhaps not very exciting or surprising pattern emerges. Bigger islands have more species. It might seem kind of obvious that bigger islands have more space on them in which more species can grow, but nature is rarely simple. And it turns out there are some surprises in the data that may take a bit more digging to make them easier to see. One of the problems with this graph is that all the data points for the smallest islands, you can see down here in the lower left, are so jammed together that it's impossible to see if there's any interesting patterns present there at all. So what island biogeographers have figured out to do is let's just plot the same data again, but this time the horizontal axis uses a logarithmic rather than a linear scale. And you'll notice how this stretches out the left-hand side of the scale, so it's much easier to see the pattern of the species that occur in these smallest islands. I've also translated the axis here for in hectares or acres, depending on your predilection, so that you can get a sense as to the right-hand side is about 250 acres or 100 hectares, and these tiny ones are really tiny. That's your 1 meter square island. So now we can see something that scientists have found studying many different sorts of organisms, from lizards to insects to birds, in many different island systems. When they plot their data with island area on a logarithmic axis, like what I've shown here, the data points can generally be approximated by a straight line, which I've done with a statistical regression there. Displayed in this way, things begin to get considerably more interesting. Let's start first by looking at data outliers, the points on the graph that fall a ways off the line. And here's Yellow Island, and you can see it's quite a bit above any of the rest of the points on the regression line. These can sometimes help us draw attention to details that may help us understand what produces some of the overall patterns, like why bigger islands have more species. In this case, I've highlighted the point for Yellow Island, which I mentioned earlier. And here's an aerial view of that island, and what immediately stands out is how many different sorts of habitats it has, especially for such a small island. I've circled many of the main ones that are readily visible even from a distance, which include beaches, rocky shoreline outcrops, shrub patches, grassy balds, and forested habitats. This is a high diversity of habitats on an island that is unusually species rich. And this might suggest that maybe the number and perhaps also the size of different habitats could be as important as island area in explaining why some islands have more species than others. There are many complexities to these relationships across our entire island data set that we're still exploring, such as how do we enumerate and quantify the habitats themselves on all of the islands that we've sampled. So I suggest you stay tuned for another talk in a year or two when we've been able to tease out this aspect of the data a little more carefully. But there are other things about this same graph that we need to look at more closely as well. It's pretty obvious, for example, that the line we statistically fit through the data works pretty well for most islands out here in the middle. But for the smallest islands, the line doesn't fit very well at all. If we use the line as a means of predicting how many species we should expect to find on an island, say of about a quarter acre, right here, we would estimate that it would have around 40 species, when in fact, most of the islands of that size have considerably fewer than that. You can see most of the data points are below that line. When we look at even smaller islands, the regression line drops below 0, which would be predicting that we'd have a negative number of plants on those islands. So perhaps our data are better explained by two separate lines. One that is nearly level for the smallest islands, and a somewhat steeper one for the rest of them. Well, here again, geographers studying organisms in other islands have observed similar patterns, which have been gathered together under the rather unimaginative name of the small island effect. And perhaps not surprisingly, there is considerable debate in the scientific literature about just what accounts for this effect with different organisms. If we take a quick look at these smallest islets and the species that occur on them, here's Cone Island number 3 with 10 species. Masker Bay Rock number 5, which had 15, it's a little bigger. We might once again lean towards habitat diversity as being a major factor determining the slope of the species area relationship. Basically, most of these tiny islets have a single habitat, a bedrock substrate in the salt spray zone, perhaps a tiny fragment of beach, but that's pretty much it. Therefore, it's perhaps not surprising that with so little difference in habitat diversity among these smallest islands, the species area line is close to horizontal. There's no matter what size up to a certain point, they just have one habitat. With islands a little bit larger than a certain minimum area, the differences in geology, terrain, soil development, aspect, exposure, just to name a few, afford opportunities for a greater diversity of habitats to exist, resulting in a greater increase in the number of species as island area increases. But let's go back to and look at another outlier, Trial Island. It's a wonderful little gem of an island over near the entrance of Victoria Harbor in British Columbia. You can see it down here, in the lower left of this photo. Here are the San Juans again for reference. This extraordinary island has an astonishing number of species. It includes nearly every rare species we found on all the small islands we surveyed put together. However, it doesn't fit our habitat diversity pattern well at all. I've circled the shrub patches on the island. You can see they show up kind of green in this Google Earth image. The brown patches between them are the grassy coastal bald habitat. And most of the rest of the island consists simply of bedrock outcrops. There are a few beaches, but they don't really contain any beach species. So clearly, there's more than just habitat diversity in the island area that are important, as this island especially illustrates. I'm going to return one last time to this graph, so don't worry, this is the last graph like this. But this time, I've added in the data we're beginning to gather for the larger islands. So I've stretched out the graph to the right. As I mentioned early on, we're just beginning to get a handle on this using several different approaches besides herbarium records. In particular, we've begun to summarize species lists from various protected areas belonging to the San Juan Islands Land Bank, thanks to Eliza Heiberger, and the San Juan Preservation Trust, thanks to Dean Dougherty. And I've also started to comb through records in iNaturalist, an online crowdsourced source of natural history data, to try and identify new occurrences for species that can be confirmed based on photographs alone. I also have added in data points based on data compiled by Harvey Jansen for 2 large Canadian islands, Saturna and Maine. Although these data are still very preliminary and incomplete, they're beginning to suggest that the largest islands, perhaps those over about 100 to 200 acres, beginning at this point here, follow yet a different pattern of species richness that is characterized by a line with a significantly steeper slope, which I've drawn in here in red. Since the points for all of these islands fall above the line describing the species area relationship defined by all the smaller islands, and it's virtually certain that the number of species for San Juan, Orcas, Lopez, and the other large islands will increase even further as we fill in the gaps and document previously overlooked species. The trend probably is real and may become even steeper. Needless to say, scientists have long debated what factors are most important in determining species area relationships among organisms on islands. While the data we've gathered so far point to both island area and habitat diversity as important factors, we're still trying to fully understand what explains these different patterns among the islands of different sizes. So once again, stay tuned for the sequel to this talk. So let's move on now from graphs to look at some distribution questions from a more spatial perspective. This first map actually approaches this from the negative side. What species might we expect to find in the islands, but which have not yet been documented from them? We've only begun to explore this question, and the distribution of Trillium ovatum provides a good example. To help identify such taxa, I've worked with Ben Legler to search herbaria databases for specimens that have been collected at lowland elevations in the Puget Sound region, but where there are fewer than 3 occurrences documented in San Juan County. There are actually a large number of such species with similar patterns, and it will be interesting to explore what factors may account for their absence or scarcity in the islands. The seeds of white trillium, for example, shown here, are ant dispersed. So it's perhaps not that unexpected that no ants have succeeded in swimming out to the islands while clutching a trillium seed in its mandibles. Vine maple, Acer circinatum, has a similar distribution, even though its seeds are largely wind dispersed. Just a step up from this group are species that do occur in the islands, but only very infrequently, those that show up on, with 2 or 3 islands. Many of these have distinctive distributional patterns that may reflect a combination of where suitable habitat is available, when this habitat became available as the glaciers began to retreat, or sometime later than that, and how they're dispersed. For example, there's a long list of species that occur only at higher elevations on Mount Constitution on Orcas Island, such as this dwarf mistletoe that grows parasitically on the shore pine that grow right at the top of the mountain, and several other species that I mentioned earlier that were collected by some of the early botanists in the area. Another example of this sort of occurrence is represented by species such as Schuyler's valerian and paper birch, which have only been reported from the tier of islands outlined in red at the north side of Orcas, Patos, Susha, Mesha, and perhaps Waldern as well. Thimbleberry, which is represented by the dots on this map, comes close to falling into this group as well, although there are a few old collections of it from Friday Harbor, pointing right here. But this species raises another issue that can affect our biogeographical interpretations: collection biases. We know the collections we have personally made over the last 15 years were deliberately biased towards the smaller islands. That was a decision we made when we started those surveys. But earlier collections were biased in other ways. A large proportion of them came from the large ferry-served islands and disregarded the tiny islands completely. The larger islands were easy to access, and another bias was that some of the species were definitely more favored than others, and thimbleberry doesn't seem to have been one of them. If we look at iNaturalist records for this species, which is quite readily identifiable from photographs, we can see that it occurs on all the large islands and is quite common on San Juan, despite the near absence of specimens of that species from those islands. So let's shift gears now and consider some of the rarer species in the islands. Overall, there are about 25 taxa that are officially considered rare from a state or federal perspective. But there are many, many more that are rarely encountered in the islands, even though they may be relatively common elsewhere. I've already mentioned a number that have not been documented in over a century and may well be extirpated from the islands, such as the rosy owl clover shown here, which has not been reported since 1923. But of course, it occurs on Trial Island, that mega gem over in British Columbia. An entire talk could focus just on these fascinating rarities, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to take a brief look at several of the individuals in one group that I find particularly intriguing, those that we encountered on some of the small islands along the south shore of Lopez. Several of these are disjunct from considerable distances and have managed to survive in the islands in astonishingly small populations, sometimes in only one or two locations. Some of these are disjunct from California or Southern Oregon. A few examples of these include the big pod lupin shown here. Looks a lot like Lupinus bicolor, but it's got much bigger pods. California buttercup and bear's foot sanicle. The last one also having a few occurrences on Washington's outer coast. Others, such as the yellow-flowered local weed and showy Jacob's ladder, Polemonium pulcherrimum, are disjunct from montane habitats in the Cascades and the Olympics. But oddly, they grow in a few locations at sea level in the islands. One of the most unusual species we encountered in this group turned out to be the only known occurrence of what Mark Egger and Matt Fairbarns eventually described as a new species of owl clover, the Victoria's owl clover. With the exception of the lupin, these species are part of a group of taxa that occur in a band of sites across the southern San Juans and lower Vancouver Island, shown by most of the dots on this map. One might be tempted to attribute the occurrence of this group of species primarily to the rain shadow that prominently defines the climate of this area. This certainly is an important contributing factor, but it likely is overly simplistic. The rarities in this group comprise a diverse array of species that probably arrived in their present locations at vastly different times and by very different means. Some may only have arrived in the last century or two, whereas others may have persisted in this area as relics from over 10,000 years ago. As a whole, this group of species is best represented at the southern end of Vancouver Island, and I suspect that area played a unique and critical role in sustaining some of these taxa that may date back to late glacial times. Small populations on small islands are inherently vulnerable. It doesn't take much adversity to push them over the edge into extinction, or at least local extirpation on a particular island. Since many of the islands on which these rare plants occur are closed to the public and are infrequently visited, threats to the flora can easily be overlooked and effects can go unnoticed until it's too late. It may come as a surprise to many that Canada geese pose a serious threat and a rapidly growing one at that. They did not nest in the San Juans before the 1980s, when a non-migratory population was introduced for hunting and has rapidly expanded since then. So these are really a non-native species that are the problem. These geese are especially fond of nesting on the small islands where they aren't disturbed by humans. On our most recent surveys in the 2018 set of surveys in the National Monument, we found nesting had grown dramatically on some of the islands that we visited a decade earlier, increasing from 1 or 2 nests on an island up to as many as 9 nests on a single small island. And as you can see, they can have 8, 10, or 12 eggs in a single nest. In such cases, the native vegetation was often reduced to little more than a few shreds. Several of our Canadian colleagues have carried out important studies in the Gulf Islands documenting the impacts of the goose grazing and feces on the flora. Black-tailed deer are another problem throughout the islands, again, having been well documented in studies undertaken by Peter Arcese and others in British Columbia. Deer are surprisingly capable swimmers and visit many of the smaller islands on a regular basis. Columbia lilies and harsh paintbrush, both are deer favorites and are only able to thrive in islands that deer cannot reach or in locations that are inaccessible to them. Cliffs, distant islands like Waldron that doesn't have any deer on them. Or as in this shot of Yellow Island illustrates a meadow full of paintbrush where the deer are actively discouraged from staying on the island. The floras on small islands that are especially heavily used by humans, where there's camping, for example, have been particularly degraded by non-natives. Where we have resurveyed such islands over the last 10 to 15 years, up to 20% or more of the native species have entirely disappeared and are often replaced by non-native taxa. Non-native species are a common denominator with all three of these threats. Galium murale, a Eurasian species, mostly reported from California, showed up for the first time in Washington on Posey Island, a camping island just north of Roche Harbor, and just in the last few years. Another exotic, Sedum album, the white stone crab, is finding its way off of the green roofs that many people have on their houses in the San Juans, where it's frequently planted, and makes its way onto some of these small islands where you can see forms a pretty good carpet. But as climates change in the future, there inevitably will be winners and losers. And as new species move in, others will wink out. It's very difficult right now to predict which species will prevail in this competition in the coming years. The floras in the islands have been changing for thousands of years and will continue to do so into the future. As we strive to protect the remarkable diversity in this area, the first step is to understand what we already have. We've come a long way in the last 150 years in developing this understanding. There's much that Washington Native Plant Society and folks like yourselves can do to help this further this process. I'd especially encourage you to try and discover species that have been overlooked by professional botanists and others, or that we've concluded have been extirpated from the islands. To do this, I haven't talked to the administrators of the site yet, but the Native Plant Society maintains species lists on their website for many locations across the state. And in the coming months, I'm going to see if we can upload some of the species lists we've compiled for the ferry-served islands. These are the ones that would be most accessible to many of you going to the San Juans for a visit. And you would then be able to download these lists and then go on your own treasure hunts to see if you can discover something that's not on the list yet. Documented carefully with a few clear photos that an expert could use to confirm your identification and upload them to iNaturalist. Then you'd get to sit back and bask in the glory of your discovery. Science benefits with one more data point for one more species on one more island, and everybody wins. So let me close with something new for you to keep an eye out for that I only learned about last week, thanks to Matt Fairbarns and Mark Egger. The photo on the left illustrates the bearded owl clover as it typically appears in California. The right photo shows what Mark now considers to be a new, yet to be described taxon as it appears on Vancouver Island, where it is known from a few locations. So dust off your hand lenses and get ready. The early spring flora is already gearing up, and taxa like this could soon be showing themselves in little visited and unexplored corners of the island. So let me close by thanking the many agencies, organizations, friends, colleagues, many of you are with us tonight for this talk, who have assisted in so many ways during this long island journey. We wouldn't be where we are in this story today without your help. Thanks. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, and I'll leave my email up here in case you don't get a chance to ask your question. You can shoot it to me via email. The question and answer period is going to be organized and overseen by Elizabeth Gage, who's the coordinator for the Washington Native Plant Society, and I'm going to turn this over to her now. Elizabeth.
Thank you, Peter. I just turned on my camera, but I don't know. I don't see myself yet. We have quite a few questions, a couple of remarks. One person said that the map you showed at the very beginning was older than the pig war, and I didn't know how to answer that. What was the pig war?
The pig war was why the islands, half of the islands belong in the United States and half or a portion of them belong to Canada. It was in the 1870s, maybe 1860s, that a pig was shot, and it finally ended up being arbitrated by Kaiser Wilhelm in Germany, I believe, who didn't want to antagonize his British relatives, and so he ended up giving part of the islands to the United States, and that's how we ended up with the San Juan Islands, and the rest ended up belonging to Canada.
Thank you for that bit of history. Now let's return to botany. We had some comments about indigenous peoples, and one person remarked that Pojar and McKinnon's book, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast, has a good treatment of indigenous peoples, naming and uses of indigenous plants. And another person wanted to know if you, in your studies, coordinated at all with tribal people on their documentation and knowledge of native plants.
We have not, and it's certainly an area that we really should tap. Part of the difficulty is that many of these islands, in fact, almost all of them that I talked about this evening, the small ones, are not tribally held islands. So our knowledge of the flora of those islands really only comes from the few herbarium collections that exist and the records that we've made. The wealth of knowledge that the native peoples have primarily focuses on the uses that they had for many of these species. But being able to tell us that a particular species occurred on one of these little tiny islands would be asking a lot of anybody.
Okay, thank you. One person wanted to know if wild harvesting is allowed on state land.
It depends. It depends what the state land is being managed for. I'd say much of it, yes. Much of the DNR land that's being used primarily for timber harvest. People collect berries and mushrooms on those areas. There's a small subset of state-owned lands that are in part of the natural area preserve system, and those areas are, that sort of activity would not be allowed.
Okay, thank you. There was one question that I think used abbreviation, so I'm probably going to mispronounce these two names, but he wanted to know, or he said that Trinova and something he spelled like Ace, Sir, C-I-R, are absent from Whidbey Island.
Acer, I assume they're meaning maple, and I'm not sure which maple they're talking about, but maybe both, Acer macrophyllum and Acer circinatum. I don't know about Acer.
Probably Acer circinatum.
Yeah, the vine maple that I talked about, it's maybe missing from Whidbey Island as well. That I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. Another person was curious, whereas there's a lot of Vaccinium ovatum in the San Juans, or no, you said there's a lack of it, but it seems abundant on Fidalgo Island.
The islands to the east, Vandovi and several others that we also sampled, Lummi Rocks right next to Lummi Island, Saddlebag, Hat, Dot, down in Padilla Bay. As you go east from the islands in San Juan County into Skagit and Whatcom County, have a remarkably different flora in many ways. It's partly precipitation. They're further out of the rain shadow, and precipitation increases as you go towards the Cascade Crest. It's also perhaps related to substrate. I believe Saddlebag and Hat Island, maybe Dot as well, have a serpentine substrate, and serpentine is pretty well known for having a unique flora often associated with it. So it doesn't surprise me if some islands like Fidalgo as well, that far east, would have a number of species that are not found further west in the islands.
Thank you. Another person asks whether it's really correct to compare islands like Trial Island and Yellow Island, which have limited access to humans, with other islands that have been under constant human interaction and influence.
That's a very good point. As I mentioned, there are a lot of factors that affect that species area curve. And I identified two, island area and the number and area of habitats, but there are lots and lots of other factors that affect that curve. And one of them is accessibility to humans. And if we could easily hop back to that graph of the bigger islands, San Juan Island stood way out, way above the curve. And I suspect that's because San Juan Island has been visited by lots and lots and lots of people for a long time. And they probably brought a lot of species with them. If there were an island that was a similar size, but not so visited by people, for example, Cyprus, much of Cyprus Island is, there are no homes, no roads. Well, there are roads, but not paved roads with cars zipping by. Blakely is another that's not quite as big, but again, it doesn't have large areas of human habitation on it. It's probably going to have, these islands will have a different species profile, certainly in comparing native and non-native species. I would expect there to be a far higher number of native, non-native species on islands with human that are highly accessible to people.
Thank you. You covered this, I think, but a person asks, what is the best way for citizens to help with surveys? Is using apps like iNaturalist helpful?
I think that's one of the best ways that I can suggest right now. I don't urge people to do a lot of collecting for various reasons, but there's with apps like iNaturalist now, it's very easy to use your cell phone or a digital camera, take pictures of species that, even ones that you don't know. There's an app for iNaturalist that you can download to your smartphone. You take your picture, you upload it to iNaturalist with your phone. It automatically tells iNaturalist where you took your picture. It will even, if you ask it to, it will suggest what the photograph might be of. And the algorithms that iNaturalist have developed now are getting really good in some parts of the world, and our part of the world is one of those, where there are enough people uploading enough accurately identified photographs, that the algorithms can automatically oftentimes figure out to genus and sometimes to species what you just uploaded. So even if you don't know what you uploaded, you can send it up there, and then it's a permanent record. I can go up and look at any species that have been uploaded for San Juan Island or whatever, and see whether somebody actually did see thimbleberry or the phantom orchid or you name it. If somebody's taken a picture of it, there's a lot of species like that that are readily identifiable by photograph.
Great, thank you. I think you talked about the impact of the Canada geese, but the same person that asked that question is wondering about the impacts of feral sheep.
There are feral sheep on Stewart Island. They've been there for decades. They certainly impact the flora. They have free range over a fair amount of that island. It's not one that we've actually botanized. It was botanized fairly heavily early on, very early on. I think one of the early collectors must have had a cabin out there or something. There used to be a lot of sheep on Spiden. There are now several different species of non-native deer, and there's the mouflon sheep there as well. And if any of you have gone by Spiden, you can't set foot on it, it's privately owned. It looks kind of like an 800-acre putting green. It's grazed down to the nubs. So yeah, where there are sheep, there's not a diverse flora.
Thank you. A bunch of people have asked a question like, what is the impact of distance between islands on the relative plant variety?
Well, that's a good question. And it's a difficult one to answer because there are lots of factors that interact. So you might think that it's very simple, that the further out an island is, the more distant an island is, the fewer species can get there. Well, if you look at the San Juans, there are source areas all around. Vancouver Island, the Olympic Peninsula, the Cascades and so forth to the east. And for many species, that's not a big jump. So there's going to be some filtering. Those ant-dispersed species get kind of filtered out by those channels of salt water. But the relationship isn't as simple when you have an archipelago like this, because many plants island hop. And with all these 475 islands scattered all around, there are very few islands that are just way the heck off by themselves. Most of them have other islands that could serve as stepping stones along the way. But even the most distant ones, Peapod Rocks are one that I'm hoping to visit this summer, that just sort of sit out there in Rosario Strait. And I'll be interested to see if what the flora of that is compared to some of those that are in closer proximity to other islands that could be stepping stones. So it's a long way of saying it's complicated.
Thank you. Let's see. I had a couple of questions about what we can do to help ameliorate the spread of non-native and invasive species. One person asked if there's specific species they should pull out and get rid of when they're hiking on these islands. But are there, and another person asked if there's a top 10 list of endangered species that we should be most aware of. So I guess the general question is, what can we as humans do to stem the flow of invasive species?
Well, the simplest and most important thing is clean your feet as when you're getting out of your boat. Make sure you're not bringing invasive species with you on your boat, on your feet, on any of your gear. Almost assuredly, that's how these invasive species show up on all the islands that are being camped on. So if you're camping and you have a tent with a ground cloth, make sure the ground cloth doesn't have cheatgrass seeds and all sorts of other things. Make sure you're not part of the problem. This is probably the first step. In terms of controlling species that you encounter along the way, that's a little more difficult to decide what's appropriate and what's not. A lot of the places you're going to be hiking, land bank or preservation trust areas, they have professional stewards that do their best to keep the most egregious, most offensive invasives in control. They have active work parties that you can join on and under the supervision of their stewards, help eradicate some of the biggest offenders. And some of those are really ones that you probably would not want to tackle yourself anyhow. Big blackberry patches, big thickets of English ivy or bull thistles or Canada thistles. These are not the sort of things that you might want to, might be inclined to just pick up along the way. And being able to detect the first arrivals of an invasive species, well, that's great if you can recognize it and do it, but it's not a simple thing. And a lot of times we'll find something that we're not quite sure whether this is what we think it is. We'll take it back, and only after considerable sleuthing we'll figure out that, oh, that's Galium murali. We've never seen that before, and that's an invasive species that's probably been carried up from California. So talk to your partner conservation organizations and follow their guidance as to how to best control invasives in the areas that you love.
Thank you. Let's see. So many questions. Thank you, everybody. I saw one that fascinated me. Why do you think, oh, here it is. How was island size determined, especially on small islands in this area with such extreme tides? And were plants in the intertidal zone included?
Yeah, good question. And we've struggled with this. Usually when we were on an island, the smallest ones, I try to estimate, oh, it's 20 meters by 10 meters. I'd do perpendicular lines. And I make those notes in my field notebook that I could confer with later when I would study these, each island from a Google Earth image. And you'd blow them up very large. And what I was always trying to do was figure out what portions of an island could terrestrial vascular plants grow on. And that you can't tell a lot of times from Google Earth imagery. You have to sort of figure that one out in the field, because there can oftentimes be big bedrock areas that have lichens on them, but they're far enough above the salt spray zone that they'll have lichens, but there's no vascular plants. So that can affect how you delineate what is the upland area of the upland habitat. So there's a bit of noise in those data, but not enough that it really changes the trends that we're figuring out. You know, it might change the island's area by 10 or 20% sometimes on those really tiny islands, how you delineate what is that upland habitat area. But it's a good question.
Okay. There was another one. Let's see, let me find it again. So rather than try and paraphrase it, I'm sure to get it wrong. Here we go. This is from Susan Waters. Do you have any plans to look at the species area relationships in subsets of the data? For example, categorizing species by dispersal strategy.
Yes, yeah, exactly. There are a lot of different characters like that we can divide the data up in, so that I showed you non-native versus natives, but there's lots of other ways to group the plant data that may be important. And as Susan says, dispersal mechanism would be a really good one to compare and see how that might affect the slope of a curve for a particular group. I almost included, but there just seemed to be too much data. I was going to show you the different slopes between islands that had forests on them and islands that just had grassy balds and shrublands, and those that were just grassy balds and bedrock. And they have progressively steeper slopes for the forested ones, because ones that have forests almost always have grasslands and rocky balds as well. So it's sort of an additive process. But looking at the types of habitat is another way that we could compartmentalize the data.
Okay. Walter Fertig asked an interesting question. Do you think the number of species in the small, medium, and large San Juan Islands are stable due to immigration of new species, equaling the extinction rate as predicted by classic island biogeography theory?
Yeah, that's a good question, Walt. I don't know. I suspect that we're still accumulating species on these larger islands. I don't think they've reached any kind of saturation with non-native species, and a certain number of native species as well that people bring out to the islands. I was just looking, when I was preparing this talk, I was looking on iNaturalist for occurrences of vine maple on the islands. And it actually turns out there are several occurrences of vine maple on San Juan and Orcas Island, I think. Maybe Lopez too. But in the background of every photo, I could see a fence or a house or something, and they were very clearly planted. So these these species are continuing to reach the islands, but it's there. A lot of them are getting there by human agency. So.
Okay, and a couple of related questions. Have you looked at the relative replacement or uniqueness between islands? And how does the distribution of non-native introduced species vary by island size?
That's another set of graphs that I didn't show just because of time limitations, but the curves of native species and non-native species are fairly simple to describe. The slope of the species area relationship for non-native species is much less. And I think the answer to that is, or the reason for that is fairly simple. There's been 12 to 14,000 years for the native species to get out to many of these islands. And non-native species have only had 170 years or so. So the non-native species are still finding their way out there in many of them just haven't had enough time to reach all these different islands. bigger islands provide bigger targets and have more mechanisms for bringing these non-native species out. So I would guess if we looked at species, at island area, we'd find the relative rate of accumulation of non-native species would be higher on larger islands for those reasons. But that's a bit of a guess. But that's one of the other analyses that we'll be exploring further with these data.
Okay, and I have a question that I think you kind of answered, but how does the geology of the islands determine the flora? Kind of a general
Well, I
question.
mentioned the serpentine, and interestingly, Cypress Island, which I hadn't mentioned at all, is primarily serpentine, and it's a big island. So that one is one that potentially could have some pretty interesting species on it. And Dave Wilderman, who works for Department of Natural Resources, has done some surveys, as have other botanists for natural heritage. But I think it's an island that deserves particular scrutiny. The geology of the San Juans is pretty complex, and there's a lot of different rock types and different islands. It's not something that we've looked at very closely yet, but it is something that Adam Martin is exploring in his master's thesis work. Perhaps the geologically most complicated islands of the smaller islands are the northern ones up in Susha, where there's several different geological types that comprise the islands. And I don't know, for those of you who've been to Susha or seen it on a map, it's got several long fingers, peninsulas. It's a very intriguing, it sort of looks like your hand. And the different ridges are geologically different from each other in many cases. And so the flora on those different ridges differ to a considerable extent, or to some extent, I shouldn't say a considerable extent. And that could be related to the geology of them.
Thank you. Let's see. Oh, one question was, has there been any fire management on Yellow Island specifically? But I guess I would like to know the same question for the islands in general.
Yes, there has been some prescribed burning done. Yellow Island has been burned for a longer period of time than any other place in recent history in the northwest, sorry. The first burn on Yellow Island was in 1986, and we conducted quite a few burns on that island over the succeeding 30 years or so. The National Park Service has conducted prescribed burns a number of times on their lands, primarily on Young's Hill in English Camp. And for those of you who are familiar with Young's Hill, it's basically a Gary Oak woodland with a grassy understory. And between mechanical removal of Douglas firs and prescribed burning, they've significantly restored the structure of that habitat. The state parks last year did the prescribed burn on Jones Island, which was the first prescribed burn, I believe, in any of the state parks islands in the San Juans. And that's being carefully monitored now to evaluate the effects of that burn on the flora. So there is some burning going on. The burns on Yellow Island have not been carried out the last several years. And that's at my recommendation. I'm interested to see how the island returns in the absence of fire to the condition that we knew it back in the early 80s before it had been burned. prescribed fire is an attempt to mimic the Native American burning, which was erratic. Any particular patch of ground didn't burn every single year. And so going several years without a fire is really part of the pattern that these areas would have gone for literally thousands of years. So it's just part of the big natural experiment that we're carrying out in different sites and different times. I can't speak for the Park Service to how they're going to be carrying out, continuing to carry out burns at English Camp, or whether they do so at other places like American Camp, but there probably will be some.
Okay. One person is curious, what Canadian botanists do you connect with on this research?
Oh, there's a whole long list of them, and I suspect many of them are. I mentioned a few. Matt Fairbarns is a ecological consultant who he's my ticket to Trial Island. He's been kind enough to get me out there several times. James and Kristen Niskelly have been very gracious in taking me around to a number of locations out there. I've worked with Peter Arcese and several of his students for, gosh, 15 years or more, some of whom have gone on to other activities that I still work with them on. Joe Bennett is one that I mentioned here in the acknowledgements. Tara Martin is a professor in BC as well, who's currently working with Peter Arcese and others on various projects. And she just got a hold of me this week to talk with me about deer management in the islands. So there's really a long list of Canadian botanists and biologists that are keenly interested in very many of the same questions that we're talking about here. And one of the things that I would really like to explore are possibilities of adding more data points to the studies that we're doing here that would increase this to include more of the Gulf Islands. I was delighted to discover that Maine and Saturna had been carefully botanized. This was actually back in the 1970s. And I hope that there are other unmined data sets like this that may turn up as we continue to look at these sort of questions.
Great. And then Robert of the Pacific Rim Institute is interested in whether anyone is intentionally propagating the rarer species to be able to outplant them and fortify their numbers and diversity, or are we just documenting the demise?
Yeah, that's a great question. To some extent, yes. Eliza Habiger with the San Juan County Land Bank and their nursery, Salish Seeds, grows out a certain number of island rare species, things like golden paintbrush and others. The rarest of the species that I talked about today are, well, for example, the Victoria's owl clover. It literally grows in an area on one island that's maybe 100 or a few hundred square meters at most. It's a very small area, and it's a very peculiar habitat. It's seasonally wet. I wouldn't call it a vernal pool, but it's sort of a vernal sponge. And frankly, I've never seen another area in the small islands that we surveyed that looked like that sort of habitat. That habitat is pretty common on Trial Island, so not surprisingly, there's a lot of Castanea victoriae on Trial Island, and in several places on the immediately adjacent mainland of Vancouver Island. But that habitat just doesn't exist very much. And so I can't figure out where you would restore another population of that. So I haven't really talked to Eliza or Robert or other people that might be inclined to grow out this species, because I couldn't tell them where I could plant the seeds that they would produce. So it's a complicated puzzle.
Okay. Why do you think that non-natives were mostly annual grasses while natives were perennial forbs? I wondered that myself.
Yeah, I didn't give you the answer to that. It's a good question. Generally, I think annuals are readily dispersible, and a lot of these islands are pretty tiny, so probably a main vector for getting seeds out there are birds. We frequently saw white crowned sparrows, song sparrows, small passerines. They'll stick to the feathers of Canada geese, gulls, so forth. So the tiny seeds of a lot of annuals can be dispersed pretty readily. That's true of many perennials, but it seems like their life cycle is more complicated than that. And it may be the question of how do they persist? How frequently can they recolonize? So species that get out there repeatedly on a regular basis, they may be extirpated and then they be recolonized again. So some of the answers to that, annuals versus perennials, probably relate to that, and that it's only the perennials that have been able to establish for thousands of years, perhaps, the natives, that have gone through that repeated winnowing and sifting, so that the ones that are there are the ones that really can persist regardless of the vicissitudes of periodic catastrophes on those little islands. In regards to grasses versus forbs, that's a little more puzzling. One simple answer is that there really are not a lot of native annual grasses to speak of. There's a whole long list of non-native annual grasses. So in an environment that undergoes frequent disturbances, and a lot of these small islands, that's the case. They just get a lot of salt spray and wind and geese and otters and things that just drag gull feces, you name it. There's always things getting disturbed there. Annual grasses can do pretty well in those sort of conditions. And since there aren't very many native annual grasses, I can pretty much count them on one hand, and there are lots of non-native annual grasses, that may explain why there are so many more non-native annual grasses in those small island floras.
Okay. Here's a question about Lopez Island. Arum lilies are a serious invasive problem on Lopez Island. Is it a problem on others as well? And what steps are being taken to remove them?
I'm not aware of them as being a major problem. It's probably, they probably are in some places and I just don't know about it. But the list of problem invasives is long enough that unless you know a particular property well, you can miss a whole long list of them. What is it? Archangel, the Laniastrum galeabdalon, whatever. There's a big population of it in one place that I know of on the south side of San Juan Island. I haven't really seen it elsewhere. It probably does exist. But that might be one that you'd think, well, this really is a problem invasive if you happen to know the Grandma's Cove area of San Juan Island. If you don't know that area, it wouldn't even register on your radar. So the arum that she's speaking of I haven't encountered, but it doesn't mean it's not a problem on various places on various islands.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then it's almost 8:30, so I think it's time to
Good.
stop. And the chat has been very full of thank yous and appreciation for your speech tonight. So the last question is, and I'm asking this partly because the theme of Native Plant Appreciation Month this year is native plants need native pollinators need native plants. So this person's question was, are there insects that impact the plant species, positive or negative? And she included slugs, which aren't insects, but let's broaden it to invertebrates.
Almost certainly. I mean, I can't imagine why they wouldn't. Insects and plants have been intricately related for ever since they both evolved. And the stories of insects and plants on islands has been studied many times over, and there's flightless insects that have evolved on islands because of the peculiar, they don't need to fly very far, and if you fly, you get blown off the island, and that's the end of you. So I don't think the insect-plant relationships have had a long enough time to evolve unique relationships just in the islands of the San Juans. They more reflect probably what these relationships are in similar habitats throughout the Northwest, in prairie-like environments, like the grasslands that we find on these islands. And I think the answer, and Susan Waters could certainly answer this better than I could, is it depends. There probably are some obligate relationships between some native insects and some native plants. Others are probably serviced by a variety of generalists that could be native insects, maybe non-native insects as well. And similarly, they may be harmed by a different suite of both native and non-native insects. It's not my area of expertise, so I'm just kind of speculating here, but it's a good question.
Okay, thank you very much. Like I said, it's a little after 8:30, so we're gonna stop and let you rest your voice.
Thanks.
And I would like to thank you very much on behalf of the Washington Native Plant Society, and thank all the people that joined us tonight. And we will send you a copy of the chat, and you can see all these appreciative thank yous for yourself.
Okay, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and thank you everybody for coming, and feel free to get a hold of me if you've got more questions or new reports of species that you think I need to know about.
Thank you. Okay. That was really interesting.
Thanks.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
And thank you, Peter.
All right, appreciate all of your work.
Folks are signing out.